Okay, moving on to the team in the ACC that I have coming in seventh place. That would be Jim Boeheim and the Syracuse Orange. And this is actually going to be Jim Boeheim's 45th year as the head coach of the Syracuse Orange. And it's crazy because I'm not going to lie. Last season, I was not very high on Syracuse at all. This offense really has been inconsistent over the last couple years when they had your Tyus Battles and your Frank Howards. And last year, Elijah Hughes was phenomenal, and he really emerged as one of Syracuse's better offensive players in a really long time. And unfortunately, if you're a Syracuse fan, he actually decided to leave early for the NBA draft. But the good news is, I'm feeling pretty optimistic about this Syracuse team, more optimistic than I have been in a pretty long time when it comes to the Orange. And it starts off with some of the returning talent that they bring back, including Buddy Boeheim, who last year, I'll be honest, I did not expect him to average 15 points a game, 2 rebounds per game. He's 6'6", so he has good size. Hopefully, he can improve on the defensive side of the ball a little bit. But I've been really impressed with him. They also bring back Joe Girard, who, as a freshman, averaged 12.4 points per game, 3 rebounds per game, 3.5 assists per game, and he didn't even shoot the ball as well as most people expect him to. So I think he's going to get even better this year. So Buddy Boeheim and Joe Girard provide a nice 1-2 punch with some experience off the bat. Syracuse also brings in Alan Griffin, the transfer from Illinois, who averaged 8.9 points per game last year and 4.5 rebounds per game with the Illini. He's experienced. He has good size at 6'5". And then the 4'5", Marek Dolezaj, the 6'10 senior, he's been around forever, averaged 10 and 6 last year with 3 assists per game. I really like him. He's a really hard worker, has always been a very good rebounder, and I feel like he really does fill the role for this Syracuse team of a stretch 4 that could rebound and shoot a little bit. They also bring back Barama Sadibe, the 6'10 center, averaged 6 and 7 last year. Hopefully he can improve a little bit as well. But you guys know, historically, Syracuse's centers don't necessarily have to be guys that are great offensive players. They just need to do their role. When you look back to your Rakeem Christmases of the world, when you look back at your Fab Mellos and your Pascal Chukwus, I think Barama Sidibe last year kind of played that role, and I think this year, as he's more adjusted and more familiar with Jim Boeheim's system, he can improve even more. And then they also have some young talent on the bench that I really like that I think could be pretty solid. 2 guys in particular. Number 1 is Kadari Richmond, the 6'5 freshman. He's like a combo guard, and I love his game. Not really much of a shooter, but he's athletic, and I think immediately he's going to be a guy that finds his way onto the court for this Syracuse team. And Quincy Guerrier, the 6'7 sophomore, who last year, it's funny, he was actually getting some NBA buzz, and I do think he's a very talented player. I think that when you look at Guerrier, if he's given an opportunity this year, which Syracuse historically has played that very, short rotation of 6, 7, 8 guys at most, I think Guerrier, if given an opportunity to get on the floor, he could be pretty productive. And I feel like Syracuse, with Dolezaj and Sidibe playing together, it's worked before, but maybe Alan Griffin may not be the same offensive player that everyone has expected him to be. If I'm Jim Boeheim, then I'm kind of using that as an opportunity to get Quincy Guerrier on the floor as soon as possible and start having him make a significant impact for this team. Because last year he was solid, 7 and 5, and I think if you are a fan of Syracuse, it does give you some optimism that last year, Syracuse really wasn't expected to be anything, and especially on the offensive side of the ball, they were really productive and really better than really anyone could have ever expected them to be. And Jim Boeheim, he's in his 45th year now, and I feel like when you look at Syracuse, after Buddy Boeheim graduates, who knows how much longer Jim Boeheim's going to be there. A lot of people have asked me what exactly my opinion is right now in terms of the ACC and the tiers and how many teams realistically I could see making the tournament from this conference. And basically, here's my answer. I think if you look at the top of the ACC, I feel pretty confident in Duke and in Virginia and in North Carolina, Louisville, Florida State. Really, those 5 teams, I think, make up that top tier of the ACC. And then starting with Miami and then Syracuse and then NC State, Georgia Tech. All of these teams, I think a successful season for them would be considered to be making the NCAA tournament, and then a failure of a season would be if one of them misses the NCAA tournament. I think if you're a fan of either of those 4 teams, if you even want to throw Clemson and Virginia Tech in the conversation as well, that group and that tier of teams are really going to be what makes up the ACC and how deep of a league it is. And I feel like if you look at Syracuse, and the way their team compares to some of the others, I feel like Jim Boeheim does have the coaching edge in those contests, especially against those kind of teams. You guys know historically, Jim Boeheim and his zone defense has been very, very tough for teams to prepare for on short notice in the NCAA tournament. And I'm curious to see this year with the COVID pandemic, you guys know that we're going to be trying to get in as many games and squeezing games on short schedules as possible. I'm curious to see if that kind of narrative adjusts to this season where you guys know historically Syracuse and the zone have been very tough to prepare for. But I do think if you look at this Syracuse team, there are so many players back. Syracuse should once again be trending towards the offensive side of the basketball, and I do think if their offense could be as good as they were last year, they should improve this year with Gerard and Buddy Boeheim back. They were both much better than I expected them, but the question now is, can they improve without Elijah Hughes and with Alan Griffin and Dolezaj and maybe even a Guerrier or Richmond having more of a bigger role in the offense? And I feel like, once again, for Syracuse, a successful season this year will just be to make the NCAA tournament. And the good news is, if you're an Orange fan, Jim Boeheim's track record does suggest improvement is on the way in what has now become an annual tradition. Syracuse makes the bubble, or is on the bubble, I should say, every single year. And I feel like if you're a Syracuse fan, that should be your goal. On Selection Sunday, feel comfortably in the NCAA tournament. I'm predicting Syracuse to come in 7th. I do think Miami is slightly better. I do think Syracuse and Miami, along with some of the other teams I'm about to talk about in a sec, are in that same range in the mid-tier of the ACC. And I'm really looking forward to see what Jim Boeheim and the rest of his staff have in store for this season, because once again, I don't really know how many years Jim Boeheim has left. I'm going to be very curious to see if Syracuse does have a better season this year than expected. Will Buddy Boeheim come back? What is the deal with the NBA? They also have some guys towards the back end of the bench that I think could be pretty solid if they could get an opportunity on the floor, with Frank Anselm, a 6'10 freshman who could play, Robert Braswell, the junior, 6'7", and Jesse Edwards, who was their backup center last year, didn't really get that much of an opportunity to play. But I do think all of those guys could maybe give Syracuse possibly a little more depth than they're usually used to. I'm going to be curious to see what ends up happening with that. But Gerard and Boeheim and Alan Griffin, that three-man backcourt is going to be pretty solid. I think hopefully you could rely on them to raise Syracuse's offense from what it was last year, and keep in mind that was a pretty good offensive team last year, plus Quincy Guerrier and Kadari Richmond. I think in order for Syracuse to be the best team that they could possibly be, they're going to need those two guys, Richmond and Guerrier, to improve and really develop. And I feel like if that happens, Syracuse could maybe start trending towards the top tier of the ACC if their defense could improve and Jim Boeheim and his historical antics provide to be successful again. So I have Syracuse coming in 7th. The zone defense, big year for the Orange. I'm curious to see how they do.